So I just released a small trailer adaptation for the story North End Faust by Ed Kleiman. So I'm going to analyze it for you guys and tell you what all these scenes mean and what parts of Ed Kleiman's story they were based on. I'll also be explaining to you the meaning behind each scene, hopefully giving you an idea of how this trailer connects to the story. In all honesty, the main reason I'm doing this is because I have to for the written portion of the assignment I had for school. But anyways, let's get right into the analysis. For the first part of the trailer, I decided to show off how the protagonist, Alex, grows up in isolation. Everything from the closet scene to the studying scene falls into this first section. The first scene I showed to represent this isolation from childhood was Alex being locked in the closet as a child. This scene comes from this part of Ed Kleiman's story. Quote, even as a child, after the initial terror of being locked in the closet by his brother, he learned to welcome the darkness, end quote. This is supposed to establish that Alex has been accustomed to isolation for years, and that it all started with his brother locking him in the closet. The scene following this one is the studying scene where Alex is in the dark studying for school. I chose this scene to establish that as his life goes on, he stays in isolation, working away at things in his life, and that he is still accustomed to isolation. This scene is based on this part in Ed Kleiman's story. Quote, as a teenager, while some of his companions in the North End roamed along the darkened streets or joined gangs that broke windows and slashed tires, he had spent his time alone, studying his way through high school and later through university, end quote. With these few scenes, that clears up the first portion of the trailer that was supposed to show the viewers how Alex started to become accustomed to isolation. The scene where he was locked in the closet shows us where isolation all began for Alex, and the studying scene shows us that he kept himself accustomed to isolation throughout school. The part following the beginning of the trailer is meant to show us how Alex built success around his life being based upon isolation. The first few scenes, including the scene where Alex is writing his study on the effects of isolation on the human psyche, and the scenes where the isolation chamber first appears, are supposed to show us that Alex now has a career in the study of isolation. After Alex's childhood, he pursues his findings in isolation and publishes a piece titled, quote, The Effects of Isolation on the Human Psyche, end quote, in which after its success, he's granted an isolation chamber. This is supposed to show us that Alex has had success with isolation in the career department by writing and publishing his findings on it. These few scenes are based on these parts of Ed Kleiman's story. Quote, while all of his fellow students agonized and procrastinated for as long as the grad school would let them, Alex turned as if to an old friend. His thesis was entitled, The Effects of Isolation upon the Human Psyche, end quote. And, quote, within months of joining the department, he'd been granted the funds to have an isolation chamber constructed in an abandoned storage room on the ground floor of the arts building, end quote. The next few scenes in this part, including the isolation chamber scene with Kathy and Alex, as well as Kathy and Alex creating The Effects of Isolation upon the Human Psyche Part 2, were supposed to show both more of Alex's success in the field of isolation, studying, and his success in his life relationships. Alex creates another piece on isolation, which is another one of his successes in the trailer. But at the same time, he meets another student that has the same reactions to isolation as he does. That's why I added the flashback to the closet scene over Kathy saying, quote, I feel as if I'm being stared at by the darkness, end quote, to highlight why he likes her. He sees a voice to the emptiness from her and has that feeling that she might be the same as him. Another reason I did this little flashback was because in Ed Kleiman's story, Alex says, quote, Alex had been startled by a sense of recognition when she spoke of being stared at within the darkness of the room. He had, in fact, been haunted by the same experience. Still, he found himself strongly attracted to her, end quote. And I just realized that that's said by the narrator, not him. Then the final scene that shows us that Alex found his success in relationships is the scene where he high-fives Kathy after they finish The Effects of Isolation on the Human Psyche Part 2 to show us that they are happy with each other. The last few scenes of this part were based off these few parts in Ed Kleiman's story. Quote, for days afterward, he questioned her about the experience, but for her, the account she gave refused to settle into focus. She spoke of a sea that didn't seem to have any bound or shore. She spoke of being stared at within the darkness of the room, end quote. And, quote, by that spring, he had gathered enough material to publish a new research paper. It had been a period of triumph. They each felt as if they had broken out of their isolation cells forever, end quote. The third section of the trailer is supposed to show us how Alex just goes deeper and deeper into isolation and takes it too far, as well as the effects it has on him. This part of the trailer is the most important part. This part includes all scenes from the scene where Alex decides to go to isolation rather than being around his family, to the scene where Alex wants to destroy the isolation chamber entirely. The first scene of this section shows us that Alex is going deeper and deeper into isolation, to the point where he chooses it over his family. Instead of going to spend time with his energetic family, he goes to work in his isolated room, where in the next scene, we know that he's going to try to last 2 weeks in isolation, showing us that he's going to go further and further into isolation. These first scenes were to build up the fact that Alex will keep on pursuing isolation and just take it to places we would say is too far. These few scenes were based on these few parts of Ed Kleiman's story. Quote, but though it called to him and he desperately longed to join it, he found he could not. The children's lives were so different, so vibrant. Was it any wonder that soon they'd won Kathy away from him? end quote. The following scenes show us the effects this extreme isolation has had on Alex, starting with the chamber scene. We see that to escape/cope with isolation, Alex tries to escape reality and jump to his mind's fake reality, showing us that since he took isolation too far, he has to escape it by going to a fake reality made by his mind. This is why I added the mind flash to the cottage section in the chamber scene. It was to emulate the story's way it describes Alex's ability to stay in isolation for so long. The next scene chosen from the story where the guy walks in and congratulates Alex shows us just how deep Alex has gone down the isolation rabbit hole, because it tells us Alex has just set the record for days spent in isolation, but this scene's main purpose was to provide closure to the chamber scene. The final scene in this section was specifically chosen from the story to close off just how severe the consequences of taking isolation too far can be. It shows us that Alex has gone completely insane because of his work in isolation and just how far down he has sunk into isolation. It haunts his life and he can no longer handle it. This scene provides closure to Alex's journey deeper and deeper into isolation and its effects on him. These scenes are based off these parts of Ed Kleiman's story. Quote, "In fact, not quite 2 years ago, he'd set some sort of a record for not leaving the chamber for 2 weeks. He developed some sort of way to cope with the kind of dread that lay waiting in the isolation cell." End quote. Quote, "When all these doubts began to assail him and he lost track of time and terror began to kneel at the end of his consciousness, he would immediately throw himself into a special psychological maneuver he devised to ensure his self-preservation. He was leaving onto a rowboat to an island in the far north." End quote. Quote, "His whole island paradise began to turn unreal, not knowing what to expect. Next, he hit the buzzer." End quote. Quote, "The door had opened and there had been the university president himself. He'd emerged again from the empty room with all the resources needed to bolster reputation just beginning to sag." End quote. And finally, quote, "He'd been obliged to walk by the room housing the isolation cell, and he'd frozen. He'd had to be helped out of the building. He knew he must find some way to have that isolation chamber dismantled." End quote. The climax of the trailer shows us what Alex does in response to the overwhelming effect of isolation on his own psyche. The final section of the trailer goes from the scene where Alex runs out the door to the bridge scene finale. The first scene chosen from the story and put in the trailer is more of a lead up to the finale, but it shows us one key piece of information, which is that this isn't the first time Alex has responded like this due to isolation. Kathy says, quote, "Where are you going? Not again," end quote, which shows that Alex has reacted like this before. This scene is used to set the scene for Alex's most extreme reaction to the overwhelming trauma brought upon him by isolation. The following scene shows Alex running outside, but the isolation chamber is constantly flashing in and out of his consciousness. This is supposed to show us that even when Alex is not at work, is still haunted by his work in isolation as well, which is shown off a couple more times in the story but didn't make the cut for the trailer. It's constantly appearing in his mind and flashing before his eyes, showing us just how insane he's becoming due to isolation. The last and final scene, which I like to call the bridge scene, is supposed to show us exactly how Alex shuts out this isolation. Alex reaches a bridge where his brain flashes his childhood memories before him, which he thinks are real, just so he can escape from the trauma. This is meant to show us Alex's way of coping with isolation shown throughout Ed Kleiman's story, which is to completely detach himself from reality altogether. This last section wraps up the trailer and was based off of these parts of Ed Kleiman's story. Quote, "And so he now did what became a habit. He rushed from the house from his wife and children and walked quickly off into the darkness." End quote. Quote, "At the corner he turned left and set off for the city's north end, unaware of the trees or the houses with lights in them, the passing cars, school playgrounds, and passers-by." End quote. "When at last he turned the corner at Redwood and Maine and caught the sight of the bridge spanning the Red River." End quote. Quote, "If he could no longer dispel that inner emptiness by dreaming of a summer cottage on a private island, then he would set those childhood memories in place of those dreams. Find some way to dismantle the invisible isolation chamber that was always around him now." End quote. And with that, the trailer analysis is complete. Hopefully this video gave you some more info on the connections the trailer has to Ed Kleiman's original work and the thought process behind the trailer, as well as what all the scenes meant. Ed Kleiman's North End Faust was a great story, and I had fun adapting it to the sort of big screen. Hopefully you enjoyed the in-depth analysis, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace. And if you haven't seen the trailer already, go ahead and check it out. It's pretty great. Oh, and if you haven't already, like and subscribe.